For centuries, people have tried to peel back the layers of myth and tradition to uncover the real figure behind the stories, the historical Jesus, not the stained glass icon. But the deeper we look, the more elusive he becomes. Tracing him through the sands of time means navigating centuries of theological edits, political agendas, and artistic inventions. What we often find isn't the man himself, but reflections of the cultures that sought to define him. The man we call Jesus may never have looked the way we imagine him. That soft-eyed, long-haired figure in flowing robes, the one hanging in stained glass windows and printed on prayer cards, isn't historical. It's a composite, a projection, an invention. In the earliest Christian art, Jesus looks more like a clean-shaven Roman philosopher than a mystic from the desert. Short hair, tunic, no beard. Even Paul, the earliest Christian writer, says, "Does not nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him?" That one line alone would disqualify most paintings of Christ, at least as far as ancient standards go. So where did this image come from? The long-haired, haloed icon didn't take hold until the 8th century, when churches in Constantinople and Rome began unveiling supposedly divinely revealed portraits of Jesus. One said to be imprinted on a cloth, another allegedly painted by Luke and completed by angels. But these were not archaeological discoveries. They were PR campaigns, holy propaganda. Their purpose wasn't to show us Jesus. It was to anchor a rising theology in something visual, fixed, and above all, controllable. And therein lies the trap. The church gave us a face so that we'd stop asking questions about the meaning. They gave us an icon to follow, not a mystery to enter. The real Yeshua, the historical teacher, the mystical symbol, that Yeshua was buried beneath centuries of myth-making, political strategy, and power consolidation. And to some extent, it seems that this was necessary for us as a species. During the time of the mysteries, before Christ, our spiritualities were becoming very diluted with so many different representations of the divine. The destruction of the old way in favor of a unified image that forced a single narrative doctrine was necessary to fix everyone's minds on an image of the supreme ultimate power and give everyone an idea to reflect upon and hold in their minds and hearts. The challenge was that these beliefs were ideated around something outside of us instead of an inner reality to embody. The journey of transcendence associated with Yeshua was destroyed, and therein lies the problem. And we can see this taking place in history. Even the most basic details we think we know don't hold up. Take Jesus of Nazareth. The title sounds specific, grounded, historical, but there's a problem. There was no Nazareth at that time. No town by that name appears in any Roman records, maps, or writings from the 1st century. Even Jewish historian Josephus, who listed over 200 towns and villages in Galilee, never mentioned it. The earliest archaeological evidence for a settlement in Nazareth doesn't appear until well over a century later. So where did Jesus of Nazareth come from? Most likely, it's a linguistic mix-up. The word Nazarene doesn't refer to a geographic location, but to a spiritual sect. The Nazarenes were a Gnostic, ascetic, vegetarian brotherhood devoted to a mystical path of purification and inner awakening. Jesus wasn't from Nazareth, he was a Nazarene. A title, not an address. But over time, those two words became confused and eventually institutionalized. One so-called red herring in a sea of theological misdirection. But then there's the question that haunts every scholar and seeker. Did Jesus even exist? The historical evidence is slim. There are no contemporary Roman records of his life, no birth certificate, no personal writings. The earliest gospel accounts were written decades after his death by people who never met him. Outside of the New Testament, the references we do have, like those from Josephus or Tacitus, are brief, secondhand, and possibly altered by later scribes. And yet, as literally billions of people believe, maybe he did exist. Maybe there was a radical teacher who walked the hills of Galilee, who performed miracles, challenged the empire, and was ultimately crucified for his defiance. Maybe he was an avatar, a rare soul of such profound realization that his very presence changed people. Maybe his life was the seed of a story so big it could not help but absorb the myths that came before it. Dionysus, Osiris, Mithras, Krishna, and all the dying and resurrecting sons of God. But if I may for a moment speak from personal experience, Yeshua, I believe, was definitely a real person. an embodied avatar of the highest caliber. But I also believe that the truth of what he did in his life has been swallowed by myth, culture, and doctrine, and shrouded in illusion. And in speaking personally, what I can say is, I have had a direct and personal experience with him, multiple actually, and in the time I spent in what can only be described as a mystical one-on-one and conversational experience, I know his presence personally, and so there's no doubt in my mind that he lived and was a remarkable human. And even today, I feel him not only as a human outside of me, but a living presence within me. However, what became clear from my time spent with Yeshua is that the stories surrounding him must be taken from a mystical lens, because so many older mythological stories have been applied to his life. And as always, I don't ask that you take my word for it, but go within and decide for yourself what you know to be true. What I can say for certain, and what we can point to, is the power of that myth, the impact, the echo, the archetype. Yeshua exists in the way all great myths do, not just as history, but as an ongoing invitation to transformation. And here's the most important part. However it was that he existed, for us today, it is the belief in the story which has all the power. Scientific discoveries today are now firmly supporting this understanding as well. As great men like Dr. Bruce Lipton explains through his work in The Biology of Belief, our thoughts are not passive. They are biochemical signals that shape our bodies, our choices, and our reality. Belief literally rewires the brain, reorganizes the nervous system, and reprograms our cells. When we believe in something, whether it's fear, faith, failure, or freedom, our biology responds accordingly. So, if we believe in the Spirit of Christ, not as dogma, but as divine presence, we can embody it. We can become more compassionate, more courageous, more radiant. We can become vessels of peace, truth, and healing. That's not fantasy, that's neurochemistry. But if we believe we are weak, unworthy, and broken, so shall we become. And that's the deeper meaning behind the Jesus story. Regardless of whether he was historical or not, the myth works because belief has power. And when that belief is pointed inward, toward transformation, toward awakening, it becomes a force of evolution. Because for the earliest Christians, especially the Gnostics, the Jesus story was not taken as a literal biography. It was myth by design, an initiatory allegory, a symbolic roadmap for spiritual awakening. Just as Osiris, Dionysus, and Mithras died and rose again, so did Yeshua. Not because it happened once in history, but because it happens again and again within us. To the initiated, these myths weren't superstition. They were sacred geometry in narrative form, coded rituals meant to guide you into gnosis, or direct knowledge of the divine. Jesus' baptism, death, and resurrection, these weren't just events. They were inner milestones on the path to transcendence. Baptism, the purification of identity. Death, the dissolution of the ego. Resurrection, the birth of divine consciousness. But when Rome took over the story, it needed more than symbols. It needed power. It turned the myth into history, the metaphor into doctrine, the mystery into dogma. And that's when the red herring was born. Because suddenly, Christ wasn't a path to follow. He was a belief or an identity to worship, a fixed narrative, a singular savior. The journey inward was replaced by obedience outward, and the revolutionary spiritual myth became an authoritarian religion. So here's the truth. The real Spirit of Christ doesn't have a face. The Supreme Consciousness doesn't need a face, because the moment we try to define it in static terms, through portraits, creeds, or history books, we miss the entire point. The real Christ is the question that leads you back into yourself, the myth that opens a door, the riddle that won't let you rest. And every time we fixate on what he looked like, or whether he actually walked on water, or if he really said this or that, we're chasing the red herring. We're swimming in circles, never diving into the deeper waters, because the real treasure was never the man, it was always the mystery.